some others deserving. But the main thing to note is that China has thrown trillions of dollars of stimulus through its banking sector to domestic industries. And yet it reports a non-performing loan ratio of under 1%. This is miraculous if you were to believe these numbers. The reality is that these loans are often rolled over, they are often hidden from view, and really the picture we see is far more complex. And the non-performing loan issue, if you were to ask certain China economic experts, would be one of the major dark clouds hanging over the Chinese economy for the long term. China's currency and the domestic consumption issue is another. There's also a demographic issue. China's one-child policy has led to a society that you may have heard the term is going to get old before it gets rich. There are many more males in China than females. We see the population slowly curbing. And while there are over 1 billion Chinese citizens, the reality is that without a growing employment base to support an otherwise archaic government system, you could end up having quite a severe demographic problem down the road. So that's not to say that the Chinese economy will inevitably collapse. There are ways out of this mess, and I have to say that the Chinese government does appear to be moving in the right direction in certain reform areas. The point really is to dispel the myth that the Chinese economy is going to just eclipse the United States tomorrow or has already eclipsed. Again, what we hear from our political class on a daily basis. And this now leads to the third myth, and that is that we are nearing or are already in a trade war with China. Now, again, the numbers belie this myth. In 2011, trade and investment between the United States and China topped $600 billion. And only a tiny fraction of that is the subject of trade disputes, what I do every day. In fact, the numbers we crunched a couple years ago was under 5%. So under 5% of all trade is involved in some sort of litigation, either in China or the United States, or at the World Trade Organization. So we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars in perfectly fairly traded goods with absolutely no problems, no complaints. Now, those numbers could be a little higher if you're talking about reported versus unreported issues. But the reality is that most of the goods and services we trade with China and most of the bilateral investment, very clean, no problem. And that's not to say that there aren't issues. Like I said, 5% is still a pretty big number. But according to the Peterson Institute, which is a free market think tank in Washington, the number of overall trade disputes, this 5% number, is actually about the same as the United States and Canada in the 1980s. And what they found was this is fairly typical of two large and integrating global economies. So when we think of all these conflicts and we hear about a case that might be coming up, for example, with respect to auto subsidies. The president just announced that case on auto subsidies. We need to remember that these same types of disputes were being alleged between the United States and Canada just 20, 30 years ago. The biggest one you may have heard of or remember is on softwood lumber. This was a huge dispute totaling millions and millions of dollars. That's beside the point. The point is that this type of friction is what happens when you have a $600 billion trade and investment relationship. Now, again, that's not to say that there aren't problems. I actually just wrote a paper for the Cato Institute in Washington detailing some of these problems. In my opinion, the number one problem we have is government subsidization. large-scale industrial policy on the Chinese government side combined with targeted industrial policy here in the United States. I just mentioned President Obama launching a case against Chinese auto subsidies. Of course, what he failed to mention is the $25 billion bailout for Chrysler and GM that, of course, is the subject of trade litigation in China right now. In fact, Chrysler and GM automobiles exported from the United States to China are subject to countervailing duties, anti-subsidy duties, because of the bailouts. In trade rules, you're not allowed to subsidize stuff like this. With both governments funneling taxpayer money to preferred industries, you are bound to have inevitable clashes. And we've seen a significant spike in these types of conflicts. And of course, as politicians put money into these industries, if they don't work out, like, for example, a Solyndra we've heard of, well, of course, the politicians are not going to blame themselves. They are going to blame China on our side. On the other side, they're going to blame the United States. And that, again, is what we see. When Solyndra started having its problems, the Department of Energy blamed China. When the Chinese solar industry started having their problems, as they're now having, highly subsidized industry in China, the solar industry, they blamed the United States and United States protectionism. And we've seen significant increases in what are called trade remedies disputes. Again, this is what I do every day. It's great for business, not so great for everyone else in the room. And those are increasing, and they are something that should be watched closely. They could further deteriorate what so far isn't a big deal or a big problem. But all of that said, it's very important, and I think that despite all of the gloom and doom I've just said, and despite some of the warnings, the thing to remember is that this is a strong and growing bilateral economic relationship. This $600 billion number didn't come out of nowhere, and it's actually increasing dramatically. And the fact that it's only a small number, or a small percentage of that is subject to open dispute is a very good thing. And in my opinion, will prevent any sort of all-out trade war. We're all too interconnected at this point. And I think that's a good thing. The last thing we want is a devolution into some sort of Smoot-Hawley protectionism from either side. So we'll continue to work through it. We'll continue to use the WTO or our domestic laws. And we'll just have to ignore the politicians every 2 years in order to weed through some of the myths out there and get to these truths. So with that, I thank you, and I'd welcome your questions.
So